Well, let's talk now to Jonathan Rosenhead. He's an emeritus professor at the London School of Economics, and he's a member of the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement. Josh Seitler is the president of the Union of Jewish Students. Ariel Moshe says BDS members have treated him with suspicion simply because he's Jewish. And Michael Diaz is a master's student at the University of Sussex and is a BDS activist. Thank you all for coming together. Jonathan, I want to start with you. You're Jewish, you're an active member of BDS. When you've watched our film, do you recognise those criticisms that have been put forward?
I recognise those criticisms have been made. I don't recognise them as representative of reality. I mean, that violent event at University College London is highly atypical. I've spoken at dozens of different meetings on BDS. There's never been any violence. Any obstruction has been by supporters of Israel trying to interrupt the proceedings vocally, but there's never been any violence. So you've chosen a clip of the exception, not the rule.
Well, there were other examples in there, wasn't there? The girl who was telling us that she'd been jostled, another man who was saying that he had been followed. These aren't isolated incidents that have happened. Do you think there are tactics that are being used that aren't appropriate?
No, well, nobody can give a blanket statement that nobody's ever used a tactic, but the general picture that we have is of rational debate, raising issues which many Jewish students do find uncomfortable. That's the word that one of your students used. There is no law against making people feel uncomfortable in politics. There's no law against being offended. Offending somebody who's Jewish because you're talking about Israel is not anti-Semitic. It's talking about Israel and what they do.
I want to bring in Josh now. Josh, talk to us about the situation on campuses. What do you hear? Do Jewish students tell you that they feel intimidated by the existence of BDS or by the tactics?
I think it's very clear that UJS currently has policy which is pro-two-state solution and is anti-BDS. That's not to say that all Jewish students support a two-state solution or that all Jewish students are anti-BDS. We know that there are Jewish students that are involved in the anti-Israel movement. There are some that support BDS. But we do know that, and policy is constantly being updated at UJS conference, and we see Jewish students constantly standing up. Again, we saw the students there that seem specifically intimidated by the tactics of the BDS movement, and they don't feel like the conversation being stifled by one side of the debate blaming or demonizing one side as being guilty and the oppressors and the other side being victims, as conducive to working towards a two-state solution. And I think, just to reiterate the NUS report that said 68% of Jewish students at student unions who have active BDS policy feel uncomfortable with their student union, and I think that's something that says a lot.
Michael, come in and speak to Josh, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to pick up on this issue of the Charity Commission and the lawfulness of BDS. Professional pro-Israel organisations have been trying to shut down the debate and change the topic of the conversation for more than 3 years now by bombarding the Charity Commission with complaints about student union support for BDS. The Charity Commission hasn't taken any action so far, and I really don't think they will, because they know that student unions have a legal right to bring up issues that students care passionately about, that are student issues.
But Michael, they do also have to protect all students, don't they? And if some Jewish students on campuses are feeling threatened by the BDS movement, don't student unions have a responsibility to protect them as well?
Look, I think it's important to underline the fact that there are lots of Jewish students involved in the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement. And I think also there's a lot of misrepresentation going on, and often what's being reacted to is the misrepresentation. I think it's important we look at why Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions is so widely supported. Israel has been oppressing Palestinians, denying them their basic rights.
Michael, we're not here to have a conversation about the rights and wrongs of Israel and Palestine. This conversation is about what's happening on campuses up and down the country, across the UK, and when people are telling us on this programme that they feel threatened by the BDS movement and the tactics that are being used at times. Ariel, I could see that you were trying to come in.
Just like, for me, the BDS movement, as I said, I largely agree with it in principle. It's, you know, I think, especially with the settlement boycotts, I think most people could get on board. Even people who identify as Zionists could get on board with boycotting settlements. But I think some of the tactics that BDS use and the manner in which they treat, particularly on campuses, Jewish students, it somewhat alienates people who would ordinarily be quite keen to get on board with the principles and aims of the BDS movement, but because of the tactics feel uncomfortable with associating with it.
Josh, I have to say your cat in the background is somewhat stealing the show there. I have to say, it's a little bit. Sorry, Ariel, the cat in the background was climbing up behind you and nearly fell over. It was somewhat distracting. It's gone now, but it was a beautiful moment there for all of us. Who else was trying to come in there?
I think if we want to talk about the tactics of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, a useful example might be to actually talk about what the BDS movement has been campaigning for. One of the big campaigns we've had over the last couple of years has been against the British security company G4S, which until recently was helping Israel to run the prisons where Palestinian political prisoners
Michael, G4S are not here to defend themselves, and we're not here to have a conversation about what the BDS movement is trying to achieve. It's about what students are telling us. Hang on for a moment. Josh, do come in.
It's also not necessarily for Jewish students to support the actions of G4S. It's when there's a conversation about BDS on campus and Jewish students are being picked out because they're wearing a kippah or they're wearing a Star of David on their neck or because they're just associated with Israel, that they are targets for abuse. That is not acceptable, and we shouldn't be standing by and letting it happen. And I think that's the reason why so many people find the tactics of BDS so difficult, because they feel like Jewish students are being victimized for being Jewish and are being forced to stand up for Israel. Sometimes Jewish students don't support the actions of the Israeli government, and they're entitled to. Of course they don't have to always stand up for it, but they're being forced to consistently support and defend themselves in ways against attacks that are not acceptable.
Jonathan, speak to Josh.
Yeah, well, I think anyone who confuses the idea of somebody being Jewish and the actions of Israel is making a big mistake. It's Israel is a state. Jews are a religion and an ethnicity and a culture.
But what about picking up on this idea that irrespective of what the views are of the movement, Josh is saying, Ariel is saying, that some Jewish students are feeling threatened by the behaviour and the tactics?
You're changing the language. The survey
I'm
said...
not changing the language.
The survey said that
Jonathan,
Jewish students were uncomfortable, not threatened.
OK, but both
Ariel, some are threatened.
Ariel and also Josh have both said that they feel threatened.
Yeah.
I'm merely reflecting the points that they've made, and I'd like you to respond to them.
I think they're souping it up, and there's a moral panic being generated about anti-Semitism, which has made many Jewish students sensitive to issues, so they feel there's anti-Semitism, where actually there is pungent criticism of the dreadful things that Israel does in the Middle East, and that's the elephant in the room that you don't want Michael to talk about.
First of all, can I just clarify that I never accused the BDS movement of being anti-Semitic. I don't think that's not something that we've said. I think the actions of supporters of BDS have been anti-Semitic in the past. And I think if Jewish students are feeling uncomfortable and are feeling threatened, that's something that has to be addressed.
Thank you all for coming in. I appreciate that. Thank you for speaking to us, gentlemen, and thank you for the cats for entertaining.